There are only 3 things separating your vibrato from the vibrato of great violinists. I'm Tobiah Murphy, and this is Murphy Music Academy. It's often been said that vibrato is the soul of the violinist's tone. Think of artists like Heifetz, Menuhin, and even Francescatti. They possess such distinctive tone largely due to their vibratos. And while developing their vibrato might be a long shot for even some of the best violinists alive today, if you don't at least develop consistency, control, and a lack of tension in your vibrato, you're going to struggle producing the kind of tone you really want. Of course, if you haven't learned vibrato already, then you're going to want to take care of that first, so I'd highly suggest you check out this video here on how to make vibrato easier. And of course, if you find yourself needing a little bit more personalized instruction when it comes to vibrato or anything else in violin playing, then please shoot an email to admin@murphymusicacademy.org to set up a trial lesson with myself or one of our other wonderful teachers here at Murphy Music Academy. But back to the main subject, let's talk about that second point I mentioned, control. Now, it may seem obvious that yes, of course, I need to be able to control my vibrato, but have you really thought about what that means or how you're going to actually practice it? To start, let's break vibrato down into its 2 main facets, speed and width. For instance, I may decide to make my vibrato fast and narrow, or slow and wide. Or for that matter, any variation of width and speed. Now, every violinist is going to have a particular tendency towards a certain default width or speed. But if you don't have control over the wide variety of width and speeds available to you, then you're going to have a very limited color palette when it comes to your tone. For instance, my default tendency is towards a slower, wider vibrato. But that default I have is not going to work as well with every single piece of music. For instance, let's take the opening of the second movement of the Bruch violin concerto. If I were to take just my natural default vibrato, to me it just kind of sounds gross, for lack of a better term. It does not really fit the music at all, but instead, if I control the width, especially, then I can produce a sound that is much more appropriate to the opening of the Bruch. Of course, experience and experimentation will help you decide what type of colors you want to put in different types of music. But having those colors available to you is what's important. So this, of course, raises the question, how do we get this level of control? Well, one of the first things you can do is, if you don't know how to do wrist vibrato, then learn how to do wrist vibrato. And vice versa, if you don't know how to do arm vibrato, learn how to do arm vibrato. I also highly suggest you use a metronome when you're practicing your vibrato. When I first started learning wrist vibrato, I spent about 6 months doing this. So I spent 6 months doing that, and for the next 6 months I worked on trying to incorporate the wrist vibrato into my music. So by the time I was done with that year, I had almost complete control over the width and speed of my vibrato. Now, of course, if right now you find yourself liking this video, then go ahead and smash that like button and hit the subscribe button while you're at it. Next, let's talk vibrato consistency. Now, occasionally I will run into this really dumb quote that I'm not quite sure who said it first, but it pops up from now and again, and that's something about vibrato being like ketchup, and you don't want to put ketchup all over your music, and that is complete nonsense. Well, not about putting ketchup on your music. Don't do that. First off, it's a terrible analogy. If we're going to compare things to food, vibrato is not like ketchup, it's like seasoning. Unless you have a particularly awesome cut of meat, you want to season your food. Sometimes, even when you do have a particularly great cut of meat, you still want to put seasoning on it. And if I was eating something and one bite had seasoning and another didn't, I'd be a little disappointed. Now, we don't want to over-season our food, but with most violin students in vibrato, that's not really a problem. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the problem of on-off vibrato. Now, just about every violinist, with maybe the exceptions of like Chrysler or Heifetz, has a little bit of on-off vibrato now and then. However, if it's something that's grossly obvious in your playing instead of just being an occasional happening, that's where you want to work on it. For instance, let's say you're the type of violinist that only tends to vibrate longer notes. Or maybe you only vibrate notes on the strong beats. Or maybe there's an unintentional delay between when the note starts and the vibrato starts. Whatever your tendency might be, on-off vibrato disrupts the flow of the music. So to take your vibrato to the next level, you're going to have to learn how to keep the vibrato motion going no matter what you're doing with your left hand fingers. Now, a big part of fixing it is just being aware that you're doing it. For instance, the other day I was teaching a student and using scales to help him work on vibrato, and he had the issue with the delayed vibrato. Like, and just bringing it to his attention helped him fix it. But if you're still struggling, a great way to start practicing this is to imagine that the vibrato motion is helping you put the new finger into place. A good way to practice is doubles on each note of the scale, slurring into the next note, like this. And do an accent into the next note. Now, that's a good place to start, but eventually you want to be able to feel that the vibrato motion is actually separate from the motion of the fingers going to the strings, so that you don't feel that you're vibrating a particular finger or a particular note, but instead that you're just vibrating and the fingers are moving at the same time. This becomes particularly useful if you want to have a little liveliness even in shorter notes. Now, even though I in-befored it, I know I'm going to get comments talking about how you shouldn't have vibrato on every note, and vibrato should just be an ornament. And to be fair, that is a legitimate style of playing for certain types of music. However, generally, in modern violin playing, we aim to vibrate all the time, and if you're not going to vibrate all the time, then you need to have good reasons for why you're vibrating, which notes you're vibrating, and not just vibrate certain notes because it's comfortable to do so. I can tell the difference between a violinist who intentionally vibrates sparingly. A good example of this would be Isabel Faust. And a violinist with on-off vibrato that vibrates random notes because those notes were easier to vibrate. So if you want to ascribe to the style of violin playing where you only vibrate sparingly, that is fine. I'm not a big fan of that style, but that is a legitimate way of playing. However, that still would entail you having consistency in your vibrato. Now, to tie this all together, let's talk about that last but oh so important point, vibrating with a lack of tension. A lot of violinists seem to be under the impression that they have to squeeze the neck really hard when they vibrate to keep the hand from sliding around the fingerboard. But what often happens is that instead they just end up shaking the violin, which is not very conducive to good violin playing. However, if you're going to have control, if you're going to have consistency in your vibrato, you're going to have to learn how to not squeeze the fingerboard. Now, I've talked a lot on this channel about the lack of necessity for squeezing the strings much at all. There's a lot of things you can do to learn how to play with minimal pressure. But when it comes to vibrato, probably the most important thing you can learn to do is to properly roll the fingertip and learn how to flatten this knuckle during the vibrato motion. If you really learn how to roll the fingertip during the vibrato motion and flatten that knuckle, then you really barely need any pressure to hold the finger in place. Barely pressing the string down at all, and that finger is not going anywhere. Instead, what you need is your thumb to be the anchor of the hand. So whenever I'm doing wrist or arm vibrato, it's actually my thumb that helps control the motion of the finger from the elongated position into the contracted position. So when you're practicing your vibrato exercises with the metronome, make sure that the knuckle closest to the nail is completely collapsing in the vibrato motion, and that your thumb is helping guide the hand back to the original position. And those are basically the three things that are going to take your vibrato from the student level to the professional level you always dreamed of. I've been Tobiah Murphy for Murphy Music Academy, always here to remind you, there is no pleasure in mediocrity. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.